If you think a multi-billion-dollar nuclear submarine is an invincible masterpiece of human engineering, you are dead wrong. Toss one down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, and the ocean will crumple its thick titanium hull like a cheap, empty soda can, instantly crushing everyone inside before they even have a chance to blink. Yet, right down there in that pitch-black hellscape where solid steel violently implodes, the creature casually swimming around is a flabby, boneless blob of jelly, so delicate you could squish it between two fingers. Welcome to the kingdom of the outcasts, the realm of the weirdos, and the graveyard of human arrogance. For centuries, the brightest scientific minds on Earth agreed on one very logical rule: life needs sunlight, warmth, and a relatively gentle environment to thrive. Therefore, the absolute bottom of the ocean, a place where the freezing cold bites down to the bone, where the sun has never once shined, and where the crushing pressure is the equivalent of a 4-ton African elephant standing directly on your big toe, should be a completely barren, sterile wasteland. It should be totally dead, but nature, as it turns out, really loves to humiliate us. Instead of an empty void, we found a bizarre alien world thriving in the dark. A place crawling with bloated fish that have abandoned their skeletons, blind scavengers that can starve for half a decade, and giant squids violently wrestling in the abyss. We found crabs farming bacteria and pools of toxic acid, and snails wearing suits of literal iron armour. Today we are going to dive into the most hostile, terrifying and unforgiving places on this planet to answer one mind-bending question: what lives where pressure should absolutely destroy all life? And more importantly, how exactly do these bizarre freaks of nature manage to cheat death every single second of their existence? If you love exploring the dark, the weird, and the terrifying mysteries of our world, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and take a very deep breath. We are going down. To understand the sheer, unadulterated hostility of the deep ocean, we first need to talk about an invisible killer. We need to talk about pressure. Forget everything you learned in high school physics class. Throw out the complex equations, the boring chalkboard diagrams, and the dry textbook definitions. We are not going to talk about atmospheres, pascals, or pounds per square inch. We are going to talk about the weight of the world, quite literally, trying to smash you into a puddle of biological goo. Right now, as you sit on your couch or lie in your bed, you're at the bottom of an ocean of air. The Earth's atmosphere is roughly 60 miles thick, and all of that invisible gas actually has mass. It is pressing down on you right now, every single second of your life. You do not feel it because human bodies evolved at the bottom of this specific atmospheric ocean. Our internal pressure pushes back perfectly against the external pressure. It is a biological stalemate. But water is a completely different monster. Water is roughly 800 times denser than air. It is incredibly heavy, it is relentless, and it absolutely does not forgive weakness. Imagine taking a thick, heavy winter blanket and laying it over your chest. It feels comforting, right? It provides a nice, gentle weight. Now imagine someone stacking another heavy blanket on top of that, and another, and another. Now imagine stacking 10,000 of those heavy, suffocating winter blankets on your chest. Suddenly it is no longer comforting. You cannot expand your ribs to take a breath. The sheer, overwhelming weight is crushing the life out of you. That is exactly how hydrostatic pressure works in the deep sea, except the blankets are made of heavy, freezing liquid, and they are pressing in on you from every conceivable direction simultaneously. For every 10 meters you descend into the ocean, you add the equivalent of one entire Earth atmosphere of pressure. By the time you reach just 100 meters down, a depth barely scratching the surface of the oceanic abyss, the pressure is already 10 times greater than at sea level. If you were down there without a highly specialized armor-plated diving suit, your eardrums would have long since violently ruptured. Your lungs, which are essentially just two squishy meat balloons filled with gas, would be squeezed down to the size of sad little raisins. But let us go deeper. Let us drop down to the abyssal plane to depths of 4,000, 5,000 or even 10,000 meters. Down in the deepest trenches of the world, the pressure can reach over 1,000 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. How do we even visualize that kind of apocalyptic force? Imagine lying flat on your back on the concrete, and a construction crew carefully parks 50 fully loaded Boeing 747 commercial airliners directly on top of your chest. Or, if you prefer a different mental image, imagine balancing the weight of a full-grown 4-ton African elephant on the very tip of your big toe. Under that kind of unimaginable crushing squeezing, the human body does not just drown. It fundamentally stops functioning on a structural level. The air inside your body would be compressed so violently and so quickly that your chest cavity would collapse inward, shattering your ribs like dry twigs. But the horror of extreme pressure does not stop at breaking bones and popping lungs. It goes much deeper than that. It goes all the way down to a microscopic molecular level. Every living creature, from a human being to a tiny amoeba, is made of cells. These cells are wrapped in a protective, flexible skin called a cell membrane, which is largely made of fats or lipids. Under normal conditions on the surface, this membrane is highly fluid and flexible, acting like vegetable oil at room temperature. This flexibility is crucial because it allows essential nutrients to flow into the cell and toxic waste to flow out. But extreme pressure acts a lot like extreme cold. If you plunge a living cell into the crushing depths of the ocean, the physical weight of the water squeezes those lipid molecules so violently tightly together that the cell membrane actually freezes solid. It turns from a fluid oil into something resembling a hard, waxy stick of butter left in the back of a freezer for 6 months. When the cell membrane freezes solid, nothing can pass through it. The cell suffocates, starves, and dies. Furthermore, the intricate proteins that do all the heavy lifting inside a living body, the microscopic machines that digest food, move muscles, and build DNA, are highly sensitive to their 3-dimensional shape. They are folded into very specific, delicate structures. When you hit them with 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, those proteins literally get squished completely out of shape. They unfold, they collapse, and they immediately stop working. In short, extreme pressure does not just crush your physical macrostructure, it dismantles the very chemistry of life itself. It makes the basic biological functions required to stay alive mathematically impossible. Because of this brutal, undeniable physical reality, human logic dictated for a very long time that the deep ocean must be completely and utterly dead. And honestly, you cannot really blame people for thinking that way. It made perfect sense based on everything we knew about how life operated. Let us rewind the clock to the middle of the 19th century, around the 1840s and 1850s. This was the golden age of Victorian science, an era characterised by wealthy men with magnificent bushy beards, thick tweed suits, and an absolute unshakable confidence in their own intellect. They looked out at the vast dark oceans and applied what they considered to be flawless, foolproof logic. Life, they confidently reasoned, requires a food chain. A food chain requires a solid base, which on Earth primarily means plants. Plants absolutely require sunlight to perform photosynthesis and create energy. Since water is exceptionally good at absorbing light, the ocean becomes completely pitch black incredibly quickly. By the time you reach a depth of about 200 meters, the sunlight is so unbelievably faint that photosynthesis becomes entirely impossible. Below 1,000 meters, there is absolutely no light at all, just an endless, eternal, suffocating darkness that makes midnight in a cave look like high noon. Therefore, the Victorian scientists concluded with no sunlight, there can be absolutely no plants. With no plants, there can be no small herbivores to eat them. With no herbivores, there can be no carnivores. Add in the freezing temperatures that hover just barely above freezing, and the unimaginable bone-crushing pressure we just talked about, and the conclusion seemed mathematically, scientifically certain. The man who most loudly championed this idea was a highly respected, incredibly famous pioneer of marine biology named Edward Forbes. Forbes was a brilliant man by the standards of his time, a true pioneer in the field of early oceanography, but he was about to make one of the most spectacularly incorrect, laughably wrong assertions in the entire history of science. In the 1840s, Forbes conducted extensive dredging operations in the Aegean Sea. He dragged heavy nets along the bottom of the ocean at various depths, meticulously cataloguing the creatures he managed to pull up to the surface. Forbes noticed a very clear, undeniable pattern in his data. The deeper his nets went, the fewer animals he brought up to the surface. The sheer diversity and volume of life dropped off a massive cliff the further down he probed into the darkness. Taking this limited data, Forbes confidently extrapolated it further and proposed what became known worldwide as the azoic hypothesis. The word azoic comes directly from Greek roots, translating literally to without life. Forbes confidently declared to the scientific community and to the world at large that below a depth of exactly 300 fathoms, which is about 550 meters, the ocean was a lifeless, sterile desert. He painted a grim, definitive picture of the deep ocean as a silent, barren graveyard, a vast watery abyss entirely devoid of any biology, where nothing moved, nothing breathed, and nothing existed except freezing cold water and dead, grey mud. And for a long time, absolutely everybody believed him. Why wouldn't they? It matched their understanding of physics, it aligned perfectly with biology, and it made sense chemically. It was a neat, tidy, highly academic theory that put the terrifying, unknowable depths of the sea into a comfortable, logical little box. The arrogance of human logic had successfully sterilized the largest single habitat on the planet, at least on paper. We had looked at a place that was too harsh for us, and stubbornly decided that if we couldn't survive there, nothing else possibly could either. But the ocean, in its infinite, mocking vastness, does not give a damn about our neat little theories. It does not care about Edward Forbes. It does not care about his dredging nets. And it certainly does not care about what humans think is biologically impossible. Nature, as we were about to find out, is incredibly stubborn. The sudden unravelling of the azoic hypothesis did not happen because of a noble, highly funded scientific expedition aimed at expanding human knowledge. It happened because humans simply wanted to send text messages to each other slightly faster. In the 1850s and 1860s, the industrialised world was totally obsessed with connecting continents via heavy telegraph cables laid across the bottom of the ocean. It was the 19th century equivalent of laying massive fibre optic internet cables across the globe. In the year 1860, a telegraph cable lying deep in the Mediterranean Sea, resting at a depth of over 2,000 metres, well past Forbes's supposed dead zone where absolutely nothing could survive, snapped under the strain and had to be laboriously hauled all the way up to the surface for repairs. When the exhausted engineers finally cranked the thick, heavy metal cable up onto the wooden deck of the repair ship, they were expecting to see nothing but cold mud, rust and seawater. Instead, they were greeted by an absolute biological freak show. The heavy metal cable was absolutely encrusted with life. There were strange, fleshy oysters, weird calcified corals, and wriggling tube-like marine worms clinging tightly to the metal, completely and utterly unbothered by the fact that they had been casually living at a depth where the pressure should have liquefied their insides. It was a massive, humiliating slap in the face to the entire scientific establishment. Here was undeniable, wriggling, fleshy proof that life did not just exist in the crushing, freezing darkness. It was stubbornly, triumphantly thriving, treating a human-made telegraph cable like a highly convenient piece of underwater real estate. The grand, highly respected azoic hypothesis died a swift, incredibly embarrassing death. Right there on the salty deck of that repair ship, suddenly the deep ocean was no longer a barren, predictable wasteland. It was a massive, terrifying, wide-open mystery. If squishy, delicate little worms and soft oysters could somehow survive the equivalent weight of 50 Boeing 747s parked on their heads, what else was down there hiding in the blackness? If the fundamental rules of biology as we understood them did not apply in the abyss, then we realised we knew absolutely nothing at all. The heavy door to the deep had been kicked violently open, and humanity was about to realise that the most alien, bizarre and resilient creatures in the universe weren't hiding out in the distant stars. They were right here beneath our feet, swimming quietly in the dark, waiting for us to be brave enough or foolish enough to come down and find them. So, a broken telegraph cable had just proven that the bottom of the ocean was not a dead, sterile graveyard. We had physically hauled up the wriggling, fleshy evidence. For a rational, sane species, poking around from the surface with nets and wires would have been enough. But human beings are not a particularly sane species. We are profoundly, dangerously stubborn, and cursed with an insatiable need to stick our own fragile faces into places that actively want to kill us. We didn't just want to drag deep-sea creatures up into our world. We wanted to go down into their dark, crushing nightmare realm and look them right in their weird, unblinking eyes. There was just one massive, seemingly insurmountable problem. The ocean is basically a giant planetary-scale hydraulic press. You cannot simply put on a heavy jacket, strap a tank of compressed air to your back, and swim down into the abyss. Long before you even saw the bottom, your lungs would collapse, your blood would turn toxic, and the sheer weight of the water above would squeeze your vital organs into a watery soup. If humanity was going to invade the deep sea, we needed armour. We needed a vehicle capable of holding back the wrath of an entire ocean. Enter the 1930s. Space travel was still decades away, considered the realm of cheap comic books and wild science fiction. But going down into the blackness of the deep ocean, that was somehow considered even more suicidal. To achieve this, it took a bizarre partnership between two men who were either absolute geniuses, completely out of their minds, or a healthy mix of both. First, there was William Beebe, a highly respected, slightly eccentric naturalist who had spent most of his life safely on dry land, studying birds and insects in tropical jungles. Second, there was Otis Barton, a wealthy, adventure-seeking engineer. Together they looked at the terrifying, crushing depths of the ocean and decided to build what essentially amounted to a very heavy, incredibly claustrophobic metal coffin. They called it the bathysphere. Forget the sleek aerodynamic submarines you see in movies. The bathysphere was not elegant. It had no propellers, no steering wheel, and absolutely no way to control its own movement. It was, for all intents and purposes, a giant hollow steel bowling ball. It measured barely 4.5 feet across on the inside. Try to visualise that for a second. Find a small closet in your house, chop it in half, and then try to imagine two grown men contorting their bodies to cram themselves inside of it, sitting knee to knee for hours at a time. The walls of this iron sphere were 1.5 inches of solid cast steel, making the whole completely empty rig weigh a staggering 5,000 pounds. To look out into the water, they installed tiny windows made of fused quartz, 3 inches thick. Those thick, transparent discs were the only things separating their squishy, fragile human faces from an instant, violent death. But the most terrifying aspect of the bathysphere was not the cramped space or the freezing cold. It was how they actually got it into the water. Because it had no engines, the bathysphere had to be dangled over the side of a ship and lowered directly down into the abyss on a single, unspooling 7/8 inch woven steel cable. It was a giant, terrifying metal yo-yo. Just imagine sitting inside a tiny metal sphere, dangling thousands of feet deep in pitch black water, entirely dependent on a single metal wire swinging in the ocean currents. If that wire snapped, and cables snapped on ships all the time in the 1930s, you didn't float magically back to the surface. You would plummet like a stone straight into the abyss, helplessly sinking for miles into the freezing dark, trapped inside a heavy metal maraca until your air ran out or the pressure finally cracked the hull. Before Beebe and Barton actually got inside the ball to do their record-breaking dives, they decided to do an unmanned test run, lowering the empty bathysphere down to 3,000 feet, just to make sure it wouldn't crumple like tin foil. When they hauled it back up onto the deck of their ship, something was horribly wrong. The metal sphere was supposed to weigh 5,000 pounds, but the winch was violently groaning under an immense unexpected weight. When the sphere finally breached the surface, the crew realised what had happened. The immense pressure of the deep sea had found a tiny weakness around one of the quartz windows. The ocean had forced its way inside. The bathysphere was completely filled to the brim with freezing water, but worse than that, the water inside was still highly pressurised. When the crew began to unscrew the massive central brass bolt on the door to drain it, the pressure violently released. The heavy brass bolt shot out of the door like a cannonball, shrieking through the air, completely tearing a chunk out of the ship's heavy steel winch before flying off into the ocean. The jet of super-pressurized water that blasted out behind it was so powerful it carved a visible groove into the wooden deck of the ship. Beebe and Barton watched this terrifying explosion of violence and realised a horrifying truth. If they had been inside that sphere during that leak, they would not have drowned. The water would have shot through the window with the force of an industrial water jet, instantly pureeing their flesh and bones into a fine, red mist. They would have been turned into human meat paste before their brains even had the time to register the sound of the glass cracking. So, naturally, after seeing their machine turn into a pressurized bomb, Beebe and Barton calmly replaced the window, greased up the seals, crawled inside the tiny metal ball, and told the crew to drop them into the ocean. Once you climbed inside the bathysphere, the crew on the deck literally bolted the massive 400-pound steel door shut from the outside, sealing you in by hammering down 10 giant steel nuts with heavy wrenches. The deafening, metallic clanging echoing inside the hollow ball sounded exactly like a tomb being sealed shut. There was no internal latch. If the ship above sank, or if there was a fire on deck, you were completely trapped. As they were lowered over the side in 1930, the real psychological torture began. Beebe famously documented the descent by looking out the quartz window and narrating the fading of the light over a crackling primitive telephone wire connected to the surface ship. Near the surface, the water was a bright, cheerful tropical blue, but as the metal yo-yo dropped deeper, the ocean swallowed the light in distinct, terrifying stages. By 200 feet, the red and yellow wavelengths of sunlight were completely absorbed, leaving only a cold, alien green. By 600 feet, the water turned a deep, bruised purple. And by 2,000 feet, there was simply nothing. It was an absolute, suffocating, sensory deprivation blackness. A darkness so thick and heavy it felt like it was pressing directly against their eyeballs. Inside the freezing sphere, the two men sat huddled together in the dark, breathing from a tank of compressed oxygen and violently fanning chemical trays full of soda lime with palm leaf fans to absorb their own exhaled carbon dioxide so they wouldn't suffocate. Every few minutes, the heavy steel walls of the bathysphere would groan, pop, and shriek loudly in the dark as the metal actually contracted and shrank under the immense crushing weight of the ocean, pressing in from all sides. But then, staring out into the absolute black void, Beebe saw it. The azoic hypothesis, the arrogant scientific certainty that the deep ocean was a lifeless, sterile desert, died instantly right outside his tiny quartz window. The darkness was not empty. It was violently, spectacularly alive. Beebe flipped on a primitive searchlight attached to the outside of the sphere, and a chaotic, swirling blizzard of life suddenly illuminated the black water. When he turned the light off, the water itself began to glow. He was witnessing bioluminescence for the first time in human history. The pitch-black water was suddenly filled with explosions of blue, green, and silver light. It looked like a chaotic underwater rave, or a sky full of deranged, glowing meteors. He saw ghostly, transparent jellyfish pulsing with electric blue veins. He saw bizarre, unearthly fish with massive, needle-like teeth swimming lazily past the glass, completely unbothered by the pressure that was currently causing the steel walls of his vehicle to groan in agony. He saw creatures carrying their own glowing biological lanterns hunting in the dark. Over the crackling telephone wire, Beebe desperately tried to describe the alien monsters he was seeing to the terrified, awestruck crew on the surface. He was a scientist, trained to logically categorize animals, but the things outside his window defied all logic. They were freaks of nature, biological impossibilities gracefully dancing in a lethal environment. William Beebe and Otis Barton ultimately rode their terrifying metal bowling ball down to a depth of 3,028 feet, over half a mile down. By today's standards, that is just the shallow entryway to the true deep ocean. But in the early 1930s, it was the equivalent of stepping onto another planet. They survived the crushing pressure, they survived the freezing cold, and they returned to the surface to tell humanity a very humbling truth. The deep sea is not a quiet, empty graveyard waiting for us to conquer it. It is a wild, thriving, alien kingdom that has been doing just fine for millions of years without a single drop of sunlight. And as humanity was soon to discover, the weirdos Beebe saw at 3,000 feet were just the absolute tip of a very deep, very terrifying biological iceberg. William Beebe's terrifying yo-yo ride in the 1930s had boldly kicked the door to the abyss wide open, proving that the deep ocean was not a sterile graveyard. But dangling half a mile down on a steel wire was essentially just dipping a toe into the shallow end of the terrifying pool that is our planet's ocean. By the time the calendar flipped to 1960, humanity was no longer satisfied with just peeking into the darkness. We wanted to touch the absolute bottom. We wanted to conquer the Mariana Trench. To understand the sheer arrogance of this goal, you have to understand what the Mariana Trench actually is. Located in the western Pacific Ocean, it is a crescent-shaped scar in the Earth's crust that represents the deepest and most hostile abyss on the globe. Its deepest point, known ominously as the Challenger Deep, plunges nearly 7 miles straight down into the black. If you were to somehow rip Mount Everest out of the Himalayas and drop it base first into the Mariana Trench, the summit of the tallest mountain on Earth would still be hidden under more than a mile of crushing, freezing seawater. At the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the pressure reaches a mind-numbing 16,000 pounds per square inch. That is over 1,000 times the normal atmospheric pressure you feel on the surface. It is a place where the physical laws of nature seem deliberately designed to instantly vaporize any human foolish enough to visit. You obviously could not use a steel cable to lower a metal ball down there. The sheer weight of 7 miles of cable would snap itself under its own load long before it ever reached the bottom. To survive the ultimate drop, humanity needed a completely new kind of vehicle. We needed the Trieste. Designed by the eccentric and brilliant Swiss engineer Auguste Piccard, the Trieste was not a submarine. Submarines are sleek, military machines designed to hunt ships in the relatively shallow waters near the surface. The Trieste was classified as a bathyscaphe, and aesthetically speaking, it was one of the most absurd-looking contraptions ever built by human hands. If you want to visualize the Trieste, imagine a massive bloated metal sausage floating in the water, dragging a tiny, heavy iron cannonball directly underneath it. The physics behind it, however, were brilliantly insane. You cannot fill a giant flotation tank with compressed air to maintain buoyancy in the deep ocean, because the pressure at the bottom of the trench would instantly crush an air tank like a soda can, sending the craft plummeting to its doom. Instead, Piccard filled the massive sausage-like upper hull of the Trieste with 33,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. Why gasoline? Because it is a liquid, and unlike a gas, you cannot easily compress a liquid no matter how much water you pile on top of it. Plus, gasoline is naturally lighter and more buoyant than seawater. So, the grand plan to conquer the deadliest place on Earth was to strap 2 human beings into a tiny, cramped metal sphere. Suspend them underneath a giant, highly flammable balloon filled with explosive aircraft fuel and drop them 7 miles into the pitch-black abyss. What could possibly go wrong? On January 23rd, 1960, the ocean was violently rough, tossing the Trieste around like a toy. Inside the tiny 6-foot-wide steel observation sphere suspended beneath the gasoline float, 2 men squeezed themselves in. Auguste's son, Swiss engineer Jacques Picard, and US Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh. The walls of their tiny spherical prison were forged from steel over 5 inches thick. Their only view of the outside world was a single, cone-shaped window made of incredibly thick plexiglass, designed to wedge itself tighter into the hull as the water pressure increased. After sealing the massive steel door, they began their descent. It was not a drive, it was a slow, agonizing, freezing freefall. To sink, they let seawater flood into the air ballast tanks at the ends of the float. To slow down or rise, they would magnetically drop heavy iron pellets. It was a terrifyingly simple, crude system. For the first few thousand feet, the descent was routine. The blue light faded to green, then purple. Then the absolute heavy blackness of the abyss swallowed them whole. Because steel is an excellent conductor of temperature, the freezing cold of the deep ocean quickly penetrated the thick walls of the sphere. The temperature inside plummeted to a shivering 45 degrees Fahrenheit, about 7 degrees Celsius. Picard and Walsh sat huddled in heavy sweaters, their breath pluming in the tiny cramped cabin, eating chocolate bars just to keep their body heat up, watching the depth gauge tick downwards into realms of pressure that no human had ever experienced. 3 miles down, 4 miles down, 5 miles down. At a depth of around 30,000 feet, nearly 6 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific, the ocean decided to remind them who was actually in charge. Without warning, a massive, violent explosion of sound rocked the tiny cabin. It sounded like a gun going off directly next to their ears. The Trieste violently shuddered. Picard and Walsh froze, their blood turning to ice. When you're inside a tiny metal ball, under 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, any loud noise is usually the absolute last thing your brain registers before you're instantly turned into a fine red mist. They waited in agonizing silence for the freezing water to violently slice them in half. But the water didn't come. They checked their instruments. They checked their single, thick plexiglass window. Everything seemed intact. The immense pressure of the ocean had brutally forced its way into the structure, and under the sheer, agonizing strain, the thick plexiglass window in the entry tunnel, the antechamber leading to their sphere, had violently cracked. It wasn't the window directly separating them from the ocean, but it was a terrifying structural failure. If the pressure shifted, or if the crack spread, their vehicle could catastrophically fail, imploding in a fraction of a millisecond. Human logic, basic survival instincts, and every manual ever written would dictate that you immediately dump all your iron ballast and shoot to the surface to save your own life. But Picard and Walsh looked at each other in the cramped, freezing, damp metal sphere, surrounded by the crushing weight of the world. They realized they were only a few thousand feet from the absolute bottom. They decided to keep going. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated human madness. Slowly, carefully, they continued to sink into the abyss. Finally, after a grueling, nerve-wracking descent that took nearly 5 hours, the depth gauge stopped. The Trieste gently bumped against the floor of the world, kicking up a massive cloud of pale, snuff-coloured, milky mud that had essentially been undisturbed for millions of years. They had done it. They were resting at the absolute bottom of the Challenger deep, nearly 36,000 feet down. Above their heads sat the weight of an entire ocean. It was an environment so toxic, so freezing, and so unimaginably pressurized that it represented the absolute pinnacle of human engineering just to survive there for a few minutes. Picard flipped on the exterior mercury vapor lamps to cut through the swirling mud. He peered through the thick plexiglass window, staring out into the ultimate dead zone, the place where the arrogance of human science had confidently declared that no biological life could ever possibly exist. And there, resting casually on the pale ooze, completely unbothered by the fact that it was existing in a pressure cooker that could crush a tank, was a fish. Picard rubbed his eyes, but it was unmistakable. It was a pale, ghostly flatfish, roughly a foot long, resembling a sole or a halibut. It had 2 eyes on the top of its head, and it was slowly, lazily undulating along the ocean floor, completely unfazed by the screaming metal of the Trieste, or the 16,000 pounds of pressure squeezing every square inch of its squishy, boneless body. Moments later, Walsh spotted a beautiful bright red shrimp gracefully swimming past the window. Modern marine biologists often debate whether Picard actually saw a flatfish, or a strange translucent species of sea cucumber that moved like a fish. But in the grand narrative of discovery, the exact species doesn't matter. The ocean had just delivered the ultimate humiliating punchline. Humanity had spent millions of dollars, risked catastrophic incineration in a gasoline balloon, and practically wet themselves when a window cracked, all just to spend a meagre 20 minutes at the bottom of the world. And yet, nature had effortlessly beaten us there. A squishy, ugly, pathetic-looking little creature was treating the deadliest place on Earth like a comfortable, cosy living room. When the Trieste finally dropped its iron ballast and shot back to the surface, bringing Picard and Walsh back to the world of sunshine and breathable air, they brought with them a profound, humbling realization. We were not the conquerors of the deep. We were just fragile, clumsy tourists hiding inside a metal egg. The real masters of the abyss were already down there. But how? How does a flabby, squishy fish survive a pressure that shatters thick plexiglass and crushes steel? If you want to survive the deep, you cannot fight the ocean. The ocean will always win. To beat the pressure, you have to do something much more bizarre and much more disgusting. You have to literally become the pressure. And as we're about to see, nature's biological cheat codes for survival are deeply weird, highly squishy and incredibly foul-smelling. Whenever human beings want to survive a hostile environment, our immediate instinctual response is to build a wall. We are obsessed with barriers. If it is cold, we build a thick insulated wall to keep the heat in. If there are predators, we build a tall stone wall to keep them out. And when we decided we wanted to visit the crushing depths of the deep ocean, our engineering brains immediately concluded that we needed the thickest, heaviest, most aggressively rigid walls imaginable. We forged massive spheres of cast iron, poured inches of thick acrylic, and welded sheets of aerospace-grade titanium. We tried to aggressively fight the ocean, relying on brute strength to forcefully keep the pressure out. Nature, on the other hand, took one look at our multi-billion-dollar titanium fortresses and laughed. When evolution was faced with the problem of surviving 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, it did not build a harder shell. It did the exact opposite. It realized that in a war of brute force against the entire Pacific Ocean, the ocean is always going to win. If you try to rigidly resist the pressure, you will eventually crack, shatter, and violently implode. Therefore, the absolute best way to survive the crushing weight of the abyss is to simply stop fighting it. You do not build a wall. You become so incredibly soft, so utterly pathetic, and so entirely squishy that there is simply nothing left for the ocean to crush. To pull off this spectacular biological magic trick, the weirdos of the deep sea had to throw away almost everything that makes a normal fish successful on the surface, and the very first thing they threw directly into the evolutionary garbage can was the swim bladder. If you've ever gone fishing, or if you simply stare at the goldfish swimming in a glass tank in your living room, you're looking at creatures that rely on a brilliant piece of biological engineering called a swim bladder. It is essentially a fleshy internal party balloon located right in the middle of their guts. By pulling oxygen out of their bloodstream and inflating this internal meat balloon, a fish can effortlessly float upwards. By deflating it, they can sink. It allows them to maintain perfect neutral buoyancy, meaning they can hover completely motionless in the water column without having to frantically flap their fins and waste precious calories just to keep from sinking to the bottom. In the sunlit shallow waters near the surface, the swim bladder is an absolute masterpiece of survival. But taking a bag completely filled with gas down into the Mariana Trench is an absolute instantaneous death sentence. Gas is highly compressible. The sheer weight of the deep ocean hates empty space, and it violently attacks anything filled with air. If you took a normal, surface-dwelling fish and dragged it down into the abyss, the immense pressure of the water would instantly squeeze that swim bladder until it was entirely crushed, completely robbing the fish of its ability to float. Conversely, if you take a deep water fish that somehow has gas inside it and drag it up to the surface, the decreasing pressure causes the gas to rapidly expand. The balloon violently inflates inside their body, crushing their organs, pushing their stomachs out of their mouths, and popping their eyes out of their skulls in a horrific process known as barotrauma. Because having a pocket of gas inside your body in the deep sea is essentially carrying around a biological time bomb, the creatures of the deep made a radical choice. They ditched the balloon entirely. But if you completely remove your only flotation device, how do you avoid plummeting face first into the freezing mud at the bottom of the trench? Deep-sea predators still need to hover in the dark to ambush their prey. They cannot afford to expend all their limited energy constantly swimming upward. The solution they found is as brilliant as it is incredibly gross. They replace the gas with grease. Instead of a balloon, deep-sea fish pack their tissues with high concentrations of lipids, oils and fats. If you have ever left a greasy frying pan in the sink and filled it with water, you know the basic physics of this trick. Oil naturally floats on top of water because it is less dense. By loading their muscles, livers and skin with vast amounts of low-density fat and gelatinous goo, deep-sea fish achieve the exact same neutral buoyancy as a surface fish, but without relying on a dangerous pocket of compressible gas. More importantly, the vast majority of their flabby bodies is composed of exactly what surrounds them, liquid water. And here is the golden, unbreakable rule of physics that allows deep-sea life to exist. Water cannot crush water. You can put a block of solid steel into a hydraulic press and snap it. You can put a pocket of air into a sealed chamber and compress it until it becomes burning hot. But liquid water is notoriously, stubbornly incompressible. If you fill a thin plastic bag completely to the brim with water, seal it so there are absolutely no air bubbles, and drop it to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the bag will not pop. It will not crumple. It will look exactly the same as it did on the surface. Why? Because the pressure of the water violently pushing inward on the outside of the bag is perfectly, equally matched by the pressure of the water pushing outward from the inside. Deep-sea creatures turn themselves into that plastic bag. By eliminating air cavities and filling themselves with watery jelly, they allow the crushing pressure of the ocean to flow freely right through them. The pressure inside their bodies is exactly 16,000 pounds per square inch, perfectly matching the pressure outside. There is no structural difference. There is no wall to breach. They have achieved a state of complete, peaceful equilibrium with the deadliest environment on Earth. But getting rid of the air was only half the problem. What do you do about your skeleton? Human beings are intensely proud of our skeletons. We love our bones. Our rigid, heavily calcified framework allows us to stand upright, run, fight gravity, and avoid collapsing into a pitiful puddle of flesh on the floor. Bones are dense, hard, and famously brittle. If you hit a human bone with a hammer, it forcefully resists the impact right up until the exact moment it catastrophically snaps and splinters into jagged shards. In the abyss, rigid means dead. If you carry a highly calcified, rigid skeleton down to a depth of 6 miles, the overwhelming multi-directional squeezing of the ocean will eventually find the microscopic fractures in that dense calcium. The extreme pressure will relentlessly exploit those rigid structures until they snap under the unbearable strain. So, nature simply melted the skeleton. If you were to X-ray the creatures that live in the deepest, darkest trenches of the world, you would not find thick, heavy ribs or dense spinal columns. You would find an incredibly sparse, flimsy, minimalist scaffolding, deep-sea fish of largely abandoned, hard, calcified bone. Instead, they rely on a skeletal system made mostly of soft, highly flexible, watery cartilage, the exact same squishy, bendable material that makes up the tip of your nose or the upper part of your ears. Their bones are so incredibly soft and bendable that they do not fight the pressure, they just flex and warp along with it. Think of it like architecture in an earthquake zone. A rigid, unyielding glass and brick tower will violently shatter to pieces when the ground starts to shake. But a skyscraper designed to be flexible, built to sway and bend with the violent kinetic energy of the earthquake, will survive completely intact. The deep-sea fish is the swaying building. It bends so it does not break. Because their bodies lack dense muscle, heavy bones, and rigid scales, these extreme survivors look absolutely pathetic when removed from their natural habitat. If a scientist drags one of these creatures up to the surface in a trawling net, they do not look like fierce armour-plated monsters of the deep. Without the immense crushing pressure of the deep ocean holding their watery tissues tightly together, their flexible bodies literally melt. They sag, droop, and collapse into sad, gelatinous puddles of slimy flesh on the deck of the ship. Take the Mariana snailfish, the undisputed apex predator of the deepest zones on the planet. Hearing the title, Apex Predator of the Abyss, you might imagine a terrifying armour-plated leviathan with glowing red eyes and jagged teeth. Instead, the Mariana snailfish looks like a translucent piece of undercooked chicken breast, or perhaps a used wet pink tissue floating gently in the current. It has no scales, no sharp teeth, and no hard bones. Its skin is so completely transparent that you can literally see its liver and its stomach working inside its body. It is the absolute epitome of physical vulnerability. It looks like you could destroy it just by looking at it too hard. And yet this soft, flabby, pathetic-looking piece of swimming snot thrives at a depth of 26,000 feet, effortlessly hunting and breeding in a place where a heavy steel submarine groans in metallic acne. It survives precisely because it is weak. It survives because it surrendered. However, embracing squishiness and turning your bones to jelly only solves the physical macroscopic problem of pressure. It stops your body from snapping in half, but extreme pressure is an insidious, invisible killer. It does not just crush organs and bones. As we descend deeper, the pressure begins to attack life at a terrifying microscopic level. It tries to freeze your cells solid and violently untangle your DNA. To survive that kind of molecular warfare, bending is not enough. You have to fight back with chemistry. And to do that, you have to get incredibly toxic and unbelievably, disgustingly smelly. Surviving the crushing weight of the deep ocean by turning your bones into jelly and ditching your swim bladder is a fantastic biological trick, but it is ultimately just a structural defense. It stops your body from snapping in half like a dry twig. But extreme pressure is an insidious, invisible killer. It does not just attack the macro structure of an animal, it attacks life on a terrifying microscopic level. Long after your squishy, gelatinous body is successfully bent to accommodate the physical weight of the water, the pressure is quietly going to war with the very chemistry that keeps you alive. To understand this, we have to look at the microscopic machines that run your body. Proteins. Everything you do, digesting your food, flexing a muscle, thinking a thought, repairing a cut on your finger, is handled by proteins. But proteins are delicate, finicky little things. They only work because they are folded into incredibly precise, complex, three-dimensional shapes. Think of a protein as a beautiful, intricate piece of origami paper art. Its function relies entirely on those precise folds. Now, imagine taking your delicate paper origami crane and dropping a heavy, leather-bound encyclopedia directly on top of it. That is exactly what deep-sea pressure does to the proteins inside a living cell. The unimaginable weight of the water violently squeezes the microscopic structures until they literally unfold, flatten out, and collapse. In the scientific world, this is called protein denaturing. In the real world, it means your cellular machinery violently grinds to a halt, and you instantly die. Furthermore, extreme pressure changes the physical behavior of water itself. Under the weight of thousands of atmospheres, water molecules are aggressively forced into tighter and tighter spaces. They act like microscopic wedges, forcefully shoving their way into the tiny gaps inside those folded proteins, tearing them apart from the inside out. At the exact same time, the fats and lipids that make up the outer walls of the cell membrane, are squeezed so tightly together that they freeze solid, turning from a fluid, flexible skin into a hard, impenetrable shell resembling cold candle wax. Nutrients can no longer enter, and the cell suffocates. If you take a surface-dwelling fish down to 5 miles deep, its bones might not snap if it's squishy enough, but its proteins will unravel, its cells will freeze shut, and it will suffer a catastrophic biochemical failure. So, how do the freakish denizens of the deep fight back against this invisible molecular apocalypse? How do they stop their internal origami from being crushed? They cannot build physical walls. Instead, they flood their bodies with a biological antifreeze, a microscopic liquid scaffolding that artificially props up their cells from the inside. They fight extreme physics with extreme chemistry. And the chemical they use to perform this miracle is called trimethylamine N-oxide, or TMAO for short. TMAO is what scientists call a piezolyte, a pressure-protecting molecule. If proteins are the delicate origami cranes, and pressure is the heavy encyclopedia trying to crush them, TMAO acts like thousands of tiny, indestructible styrofoam packing peanuts stuffed inside and around the paper folds. When a deep-sea fish floods its cells with TMAO, this miraculous little molecule gets to work. It possesses a powerful electrical charge that strongly attracts water molecules. The TMAA tightly binds to the water, pulling it away from the delicate proteins and locking it into a rigid cage-like structure. It essentially acts as a microscopic bouncer, aggressively grabbing the pressurized water molecules and preventing them from wedging themselves into the proteins and tearing them apart. It holds the water back, artificially maintaining the precise three-dimensional shape of the protein, and keeps the cell membrane fluid and flexible even when the surrounding pressure is trying to freeze it solid. It is a brilliant, elegant, and entirely flawless biological defense mechanism. It allows the Mariana snailfish to casually swim in environments that would instantly turn a human's biochemistry into useless, unfolded mush. But as with all things in the deep sea, this miraculous survival tactic comes with a deeply weird and incredibly disgusting side effect. TMAO might be a life-saving miracle molecule, but you actually already know exactly what it is, and you have almost certainly smelled it. Have you ever walked past a fish market on a hot, humid summer afternoon? Have you ever opened a plastic container of leftover seafood that has been sitting in the back of your refrigerator for just a few days too long? That pungent, eye-watering, deeply offensive stench of rotting fish, that chemical smell that makes your stomach instantly churn, is TMAO. When a fish dies, bacteria begin to break down the TMAO in its tissues, converting it into a closely related chemical called trimethylamine, TMA, which is the exact compound responsible for that foul, ammonia-like rotting fish odour. Because TMAO is the only thing keeping deep-sea fish from violently imploding on a molecular level, there is a very strict mathematical rule governing life in the abyss. The deeper you go, the more pressure there is. Therefore, the deeper you go, the more TMAO you must pack into your cells to survive. Consequently, the deeper a fish lives, the more intensely, unbelievably putrid it smells. Surface fish, like the salmon or the tuna you eat for dinner, have relatively low levels of TMAO. But if you were to haul up a deep-sea snailfish from the Mariana Trench and try to cook it, you would not be able to get it anywhere near your mouth. The sheer, overwhelming concentration of TMAO in its flabby gelatinous flesh would make it smell like a toxic mixture of rotting garbage, concentrated urine, and industrial bleach. They are, quite literally, the worst-smelling creatures on planet Earth, reeking of chemical death precisely because that exact chemical is what keeps them alive. It is a beautiful irony of nature. The ultimate armour against the most lethal environment on the planet is simply being incredibly, offensively stinky. However, this chemical cheat code has a fatal flaw. It is not a magical infinite shield. There is a hard mathematical ceiling, or rather a flaw, to how much TMAO a living animal can physically pump into its own body. Remember that TMAO is basically a salt-like chemical. As a fish descends deeper and deeper into the trench, it must continuously produce more and more TMAO to counteract the ever-increasing pressure. But eventually the concentration of TMA inside the fish's cells becomes so incredibly high that it triggers a different biological crisis: osmosis. If you put too much salt or chemicals into a cell, the cell becomes hyperosmotic. It starts violently sucking in water from the surrounding ocean to try and balance out the concentration. If a fish were to pack any more TMAO into its tissues to survive pressures past a certain depth, its cells would suck in so much seawater that they would physically burst like overfilled water balloons. Because of this unbreakable chemical limitation, scientists have discovered a terrifying fish barrier in the deep ocean. No matter how squishy they get, no matter how much they smell like rotting garbage, fish simply cannot exist below a depth of roughly 8,200 to 8,400 meters, about 27,000 feet. Down there, the TMAO limit is reached. Any deeper, and a fish must either let the pressure crush its proteins or let the TMAO concentration burst its cells. It is an absolute biological checkmate. When we sent remote-controlled submersibles down past the 8,400 metre mark, descending toward the absolute bottom of the Mariana Trench at 11,000 metres, the fish completely vanished. The watery, ghostly snail fish that ruled the upper abyss was suddenly gone. It was just silent, empty mud. For a brief moment, scientists thought they had finally found the true dead zone. They thought that below 8,400 metres, the pressure was simply too great for any complex animal to survive. But they were wrong. The fish had reached their limit, yes. But vertebrates, animals with backbones, are a relatively recent and incredibly fragile evolutionary invention. When the fish tap out and the environment becomes truly apocalyptic, the invertebrates take over. The freaks without backbones, the scavengers, and the ancient armoured monsters step into the spotlight. We are about to enter the true biological freak show, a gallery of grotesques, where giant blind bugs scavenge in the dark, and squids the size of school buses engage in violent, bloody combat. Now that we understand the absolute biological cheating required to survive the crushing depths, melting your bones, ditching your gas, and packing your cells full of rotting chemical fish stink, it is time to actually walk through the gallery of the grotesque. Welcome to the Deep Sea Freak Show. This is where evolution stopped trying to be beautiful, and instead focused purely on a brutal, unrelenting pragmatism. The first stop on our tour of deep-sea weirdos is a creature that has been terribly, unfairly maligned by human ignorance. If you ask the internet what the ugliest animal on planet Earth is, the answer is almost always unanimous: the blobfish. You have absolutely seen the pictures. The blobfish looks exactly like its name suggests. It's a massive, flabby, pale pink lump of gelatinous fat, sporting a bulbous, cartoonishly large nose and a mouth turned firmly downward in a permanent, miserable frown. It looks like a grumpy, bald, overweight man who just woke up from a terrible nap. In 2013, the Ugly Animal Preservation Society officially voted it the ugliest creature in the world. We laughed at it. We turned it into memes and we printed its miserable, sagging face on coffee mugs and t-shirts. But our collective laughter is actually a profound display of human ignorance. We are not laughing at a naturally ugly animal. We are laughing at the victim of a catastrophic, explosive physical trauma. You see, the blobfish, known scientifically as Cycrolutes marchidus, lives off the coast of Australia and Tasmania at depths ranging from 2,000 to 4,000 feet. Down in its natural habitat, the pressure is roughly 120 times greater than at the surface. In that dark, crushing environment, the blobfish is not a droopy, miserable lump of fat. It actually looks like a completely normal, relatively handsome, well-proportioned fish. Remember our lesson on the physical architecture of the abyss. To survive extreme pressure, you have to match it. The blobfish has almost no bones and it possesses zero muscle mass. Its entire body is essentially constructed out of a highly specialised watery jelly that is just slightly less dense than the freezing seawater around it. This gelatinous makeup is a stroke of evolutionary genius, because its body is essentially made of the same stuff as the ocean. The crushing pressure of the deep does not harm it. Rather, the pressure acts as an invisible corset. The immense weight of the water firmly holds the blobfish's jelly-like tissues together, pushing it into the shape of a normal functioning fish. It does not need to swim. It just effortlessly hovers just above the seafloor, casually opening its mouth to swallow whatever edible debris happens to drift by. It is the ultimate couch potato of the abyss, living a life of supreme, zero-gravity relaxation. But when a human trawling vessel carelessly drags a net across the seafloor, catches a blobfish, and hauls it thousands of feet up to the surface in a matter of minutes, a biological nightmare occurs. As the fish is dragged violently upward, the immense pressure that holds its gelatinous body together rapidly vanishes. The invisible corset is ripped away. The sudden, extreme decompression causes the tissue to rapidly expand and fundamentally lose its structural integrity. By the time it hits the wooden deck of the ship, the poor creature has essentially melted. Its tissue violently sags, its skin radically stretches out, and it collapses under the unfamiliar force of surface gravity into that famous, miserable pink puddle. Imagine for a second if a highly advanced race of deep-sea aliens suddenly abducted a human being from a comfortable living room, violently dragged them out into the lethal vacuum of deep space without a spacesuit, watched as the explosive decompression bloated and grotesquely deformed their human body into a terrifying meat balloon, and then snapped a photograph and voted them the ugliest creature in the universe. That is exactly what we did to the blobfish. On the surface it is a hideous freak, but in the crushing dark it is a masterclass in survival. However, the deep ocean is not just populated by passive floating lumps of jelly waiting for a free meal. The midwater column, the vast lightless void known as the Midnight Zone, is an arena for the most violent titanic clashes in the natural world. It is the battlefield of the giants. If you want to talk about monsters, we must talk about the giant squid, Architeuthis ducks. For centuries, sailors terrified each other in taverns with stories of the Kraken, a demonic, multi-tentacled leviathan that would rise from the black depths to drag entire galleons down to their doom. Science dismissed these tales as drunken hallucinations right up until the rotting, massive corpses of these real-life monsters started washing up on beaches. The giant squid is the ultimate invertebrate nightmare. They can grow up to 40 feet long, the size of a standard yellow school bus. Their arms are lined with hundreds of suction cups, and each cup is ringed with serrated razor-sharp teeth designed to violently hook into flesh and never let go. At the centre of their tangled mass of tentacles is a massive, razor-sharp beak resembling that of a parrot, strong enough to easily bite through steel cable. But the most terrifying feature of the giant squid is its eyes. They possess the largest eyes in the animal kingdom, roughly the size of a regulation basketball. In an environment with absolutely zero sunlight, having massive eyes seems counterintuitive. But down there, the squid is not looking for sunlight. It is looking for the faint ghostly flashes of bioluminescence in the dark, the tiny electrical sparks given off by moving prey or, more importantly, approaching danger. Because it has no rigid skeleton, the giant squid is perfectly at home in the crushing pressure. It is essentially a massive, highly intelligent bag of water, muscle and ink, navigating the abyss with absolute impunity. It is an apex predator, a silent assassin of the deep. But the giant squid is not at the absolute top of the food chain. It is constantly being hunted by a creature that, logically, has absolutely no business being in the deep ocean at all. Enter the sperm whale. The sperm whale is a mammal. It has warm blood, it gives birth to live young, and most importantly, it has lungs. It must breathe the exact same atmospheric air that you and I do. If you took a human, gave them a lungful of air and dropped them 3,000 feet down, the pressure would violently crush their ribcage inward, exploding their lungs and instantly killing them. Yet the sperm whale, an animal that breathes air, routinely dives down to depths of over 7,000 feet, plunging directly into the crushing darkness for over an hour at a time, specifically to hunt the giant squid. How does an air-breathing mammal survive the pressure cooker that melts submarines? The sperm whale survives by actively choosing to crush itself before the ocean can do it. When a sperm whale prepares for a deep dive, it takes a massive breath, but it does not keep that air in its lungs. Instead, its blood and muscles are flooded with massive, highly concentrated amounts of a special protein called myoglobin, which acts like a biological sponge, instantly absorbing and aggressively storing the oxygen molecules. As the whale dives deeper and the pressure rapidly mounts, it does not fight to keep its chest expanded. It does the exact opposite. Its ribcage is uniquely hinged and highly flexible. The whale simply lets the immense weight of the ocean fold its ribs completely flat, violently collapsing its own lungs down to a tiny fraction of their normal size. By forcibly removing the pocket of compressible gas from its chest, the whale eliminates the threat of being crushed. It turns its massive body into a dense, solid, sinking rock. It holds its breath not in its lungs, but directly in its muscles. Down in the pitch-black void, these two titans collide. It is a battle we have almost never witnessed with our own eyes, taking place miles beneath the waves in absolute sensory deprivation darkness. The whale relies on a massive organ in its head, filled with thick, waxy oil, to project highly concentrated clicks of sound into the abyss, using advanced biological sonar to violently blast the dark water, until the acoustic shockwaves bounce off the squishy, gelatinous body of the squid. The squid, completely deaf to the whale's sonar, relies on its massive basketball-sized eyes to catch the faint bioluminescent glow stirred up by the whale's massive tail. When they clash, it is a hurricane of violence. The squid aggressively wraps its massive tentacles around the whale's head, desperately digging those razor-sharp serrated suckers deep into the thick blubber, trying to suffocate the mammal or gouge out its eyes. The whale violently thrashes, snapping its massive jaw, trying to crush the squid's fleshy mantle and tear off its tentacles. We know these apocalyptic battles happen constantly, not because we have filmed them, but because of the scars. When deep-sea sperm whales surface for air, their massive, blocky heads are entirely covered in hundreds of perfectly circular, jagged white scars, the permanent carved signatures of the giant squid's razor-sharp suckers. Inside the stomachs of dead sperm whales, scientists routinely find thousands of undigested razor-sharp squid beaks, the only part of the monster that the whale's stomach acids cannot dissolve. It is a silent, brutal war waged every single day in a realm where humans cannot even step foot. But as terrifying as a 40-foot squid wrestling a 60-ton whale might be, they are still, ultimately, creatures that move, hunt, and fight. As we drop even deeper, all the way down to the abyssal mud, the energy runs out. The violence stops, and the slow, creeping horror of the absolute bottom takes over. Down there, the true scavengers rule. The bugs of the deep are waiting. If the midwater column is a violent, churning gladiator arena where giant squids and massive whales tear each other apart, the absolute bottom, the abyssal plain, is something entirely different. It is an endless, freezing, completely flat desert composed of pale, suffocating mud. Down here, the violence stops, mostly because nobody has the energy to fight. In an environment where the sun never shines, there are no plants. Without plants, there is no base food chain. The creatures that live down in the crushing dark must rely almost entirely on whatever dead, decaying matter randomly falls from the sunlit world miles above. Biologists romantically call this marine snow. In reality, it is a constant slow-motion drizzle of fish scales, microscopic poop, and rotting flesh. To survive in this desolate wasteland, you cannot be a picky eater, and you cannot afford to have a fast metabolism. You must become the ultimate, uncomplaining garbage disposal of the sea. Enter the giant isopod. If you want to know exactly what a giant isopod looks like, go out into your garden, lift up a damp rock, and look at those tiny, grey, armour-plated bugs that instantly roll themselves into a tight ball when you touch them. You probably call them pill bugs, wood lice, or roly-polies. Now imagine taking one of those harmless microscopic garden bugs, exposing it to extreme radiation, and blowing it up to the size of a bulldog. That is the giant isopod. They can grow to be over 2.5 feet long. They're a terrifying living example of a biological phenomenon known as deep-sea gigantism, where invertebrates living in the freezing, highly pressurized abyss somehow grow exponentially larger than their shallow water relatives. They possess 14 articulated legs, 2 pairs of thick antennae, and a pair of massive, highly reflective triangular compound eyes that make them look like alien drones silently patrolling the ocean floor. Unlike the squishy, gelatinous blobfish, the giant isopod is heavily armoured. Its back is covered in thick, overlapping calcareous plates. It does not need to worry about the pressure shattering its shell because, just like the fish, its internal cavity is completely flooded with fluids that perfectly match the crushing pressure of the surrounding ocean. But their true superpower is not their armour. It is their terrifying, almost supernatural patience. Because food in the deep ocean is so incredibly scarce, a giant isopod might wander the freezing mud for months or even years without finding a single scrap to eat. To survive this brutal famine, their metabolism operates at a glacial pace. They enter a state of semi-suspended animation, barely moving, barely breathing, utilizing virtually 0 calories as they wait in the pitch-black void. In a famous observation at an aquarium in Japan, a captive giant isopod named Number 1 was offered a piece of fish. It took a few bites, swallowed, and then simply stopped eating. It refused all food for 5 solid years. It sat there, perfectly alive, completely unbothered, surviving on absolute nothingness for half a decade before finally dying of starvation. They are the ultimate opportunists. When a massive bounty finally arrives, like a 60-ton dead whale sinking from the surface and smashing into the sea floor, the isopods awaken. They crawl out of the darkness by the thousands, descending upon the rotting carcass. They gorge themselves so violently and so greedily that they fundamentally compromise their own ability to walk. They stuff their massive guts with so much dead flesh that they literally become too fat to bend their articulated legs, lying completely immobilized in a food coma next to the bones, waiting patiently to digest their meal over the next few years. But starvation is only the second worst problem in the deep sea. The absolute greatest threat to the survival of any species down here is loneliness. The ocean is incomprehensibly massive. It is a three-dimensional void containing hundreds of millions of cubic miles of pitch-black water. If you are a deep-sea creature trying to keep your species alive, the mathematical odds of simply bumping into a member of the opposite sex in the dark are virtually zero. It is like being blindfolded, dropped somewhere in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and being told to find another specific blindfolded person who is actively swimming around. To solve this impossible problem, evolution created the anglerfish, a creature that has turned the concept of romance into the most horrific, nightmarish body horror scenario in the animal kingdom. When you picture an anglerfish, you're picturing the female. She is the iconic nightmare of the deep. She's basically a massive floating head, essentially nothing but an aggressively large gaping maw lined with dozens of long translucent needle-sharp teeth that are angled backward to prevent any prey from ever escaping. She is an ambush predator, because swimming around looking for food wastes too much precious energy. She simply floats motionless in the pitch black. Growing directly out of her forehead is a highly modified, elongated dorsal fin. At the very tip of this biological fishing pole is a fleshy lure, a tiny bulb packed densely with millions of symbiotic bioluminescent bacteria. The anglerfish does not hunt. She simply waits in the dark, dangling a glowing neon sign that says free food directly in front of a meat grinder. When a curious fish or squid comes close to investigate the pretty blue light, her jaws snap shut with the speed and violence of an industrial bear trap. But as terrifying as the female anglerfish is, her physical appearance is absolutely nothing compared to the tragic, miserable existence of the male. For a very long time, human scientists thought they had only ever discovered female anglerfish. Every specimen they hauled up in their nets was a massive, teeth-bearing female. It wasn't until scientists looked closer at the strange, fleshy bumps attached to the sides and bellies of these females that they realized the horrifying truth. The male anglerfish is not a terrifying monster. He's incredibly tiny, barely the size of a human finger. He has no glowing lure. He has absolutely no functioning digestive system. From the exact moment he hatches from his egg, he is physically incapable of eating. He is a biological ticking time bomb, running on whatever tiny fat reserves he was born with. He has only one purpose in his tragically short life. He is a highly specialized heat-seeking sperm missile. The male comes equipped with a massive, highly sensitive olfactory organ, a giant nose that takes up most of his tiny head. He frantically swims through the freezing, crushing darkness, desperately sniffing the water for the faint, distinct chemical pheromones left behind by a female. If he does not find her within a few weeks, he will simply starve to death and dissolve in the mud. But if he gets lucky, if he follows the chemical trail and actually finds a massive, terrifying female floating in the dark, he does not perform a mating dance. He does not impress her. He simply swims up to her enormous, flabby body and bites her as hard as he can. Then the true horror begins. Evolution is not romantic, and it certainly does not care about dignity. Finding a mate is so incredibly difficult in the abyss that once the male finds a female, he literally never lets go. When he bites her, a special enzyme is released from his mouth. This highly corrosive chemical violently melts his own lips, completely dissolving the skin between his mouth and her body. Their tissues physically fuse together. Within days, their blood vessels intertwine. The male completely taps into the female's circulatory system, acting like a horrific, permanent parasite. He drinks her blood to survive. But it gets much worse. Because he is now permanently plugged into the female's life support system, his own body realizes that it no longer needs most of its parts. To conserve energy, the male begins to dismantle himself. His eyes dissolve and melt away. His fins rot off. His internal organs, his brain, his heart, they all break down and are completely reabsorbed into the fleshy mass. He loses all sense of self. He ceases to be an independent living organism. The only thing that remains of the male anglerfish is a pair of functioning testicles, encased in a fleshy lump permanently grafted to the female's side. The female will carry this lump with her for the rest of her life, a living, on-demand sperm bank that she can tap into whenever she decides it is time to release her eggs into the water column. Some large female anglerfish have been hauled up to the surface with half a dozen of these melted parasitic males permanently welded to their bodies. It is a brutally efficient, utterly ruthless solution to the problem of finding a mate in the deep ocean. It proves that to survive where pressure should destroy all life, you have to be willing to sacrifice absolutely everything. Your bones, your gas, your eyes, and in the case of the anglerfish, your entire physical existence. But as bizarre as the anglerfish and the giant isopod are, they are still just playing by the rules of biology. As we go even deeper down to the absolute deepest point of the ocean floor, we will find a creature that has decided it does not need bones, or armour, or teeth to rule the abyss. It just needs to be entirely perfectly empty. We have descended through the twilight zone, past the violent battlegrounds of the giant squids and the sperm whales. We have dropped down to the abyssal plain, where giant armoured pillbugs gorge themselves into absolute immobile gluttony, and where the anglerfish has turned mating into a permanent rotting parasitic nightmare. We are now incredibly, terrifyingly deep, but we are not at the bottom. To find the ultimate champion of the vertebrates, the absolute undisputed king of the deep sea fish, we have to keep going. We have to drop past 20,000 feet. We have to enter the Hadal Zone, named quite literally after Hades, the ancient Greek underworld. We are descending directly into the crushing V-shaped scars of the Mariana Trench. Down here, at a depth of roughly 26,000 feet, nearly 5 miles straight down into the black, the pressure reaches an apocalyptic 11,000 pounds per square inch. It is an environment so violently hostile that it practically defies human comprehension. If you are a fan of science fiction, or if you simply have a basic dramatic understanding of how the world should work, you naturally assume that the apex predator of this hellscape must be an absolute nightmare. The final boss of the Mariana Trench should logically be a terrifying armour-plated leviathan, covered in jagged spikes, sporting glowing red eyes, and possessing jaws strong enough to bite a nuclear submarine in half. It should look like Godzilla. Instead, the undisputed apex predator of the deepest abyss on Earth looks like a piece of wet pink tissue paper floating gently in the current. Meet the Mariana snailfish, scientifically known as Pseudoliparis swirare. When marine biologists first sent baited camera traps down to 26,000 feet in 2014, they honestly did not expect to see much. They were probing the absolute very limits of where the mathematical TMAO fish barrier dictated that vertebrates could theoretically survive. They expected perhaps to see a lonely struggling crustacean, or maybe nothing but empty dead mud. Instead, their cameras captured a thriving, energetic swarm of gelatinous ghosts. The bait was absolutely swarmed by dozens of Mariana snailfish, swimming happily and actively in an environment that would instantly turn a human being into a red stain on the rocks. The Mariana snailfish is the ultimate, flawless culmination of every biological cheat code we have talked about so far. It has not just adapted to the pressure, it has completely surrendered to it, turning itself into a masterclass of physical vulnerability. If you look closely at one, it seems completely unfinished, like a rough draft of a fish that evolution simply forgot to paint. It has absolutely no scales. Scales are dense, heavy, and rigid. Everything that extreme pressure loves to ruthlessly exploit. Instead, its skin is completely bare, highly gelatinous and entirely translucent. It is a swimming ghost. You can look straight through its soft, flabby exterior and clearly see its liver, its stomach, and its incredibly fragile, sparse skeleton working away inside. And that skeleton is a marvel of evolutionary compromise. We already know that deep-sea fish replace hard bone with soft cartilage, but the Mariana snailfish takes it a step further. It has actually left large, intentional gaps in its own skull. Think about the human skull. It is a solid, completely fused dome of hard bone, designed to rigidly protect the delicate brain inside. If you took a human skull down to the Mariana Trench, the immense multi-directional squeezing of the ocean would violently crush that rigid dome inward, instantly turning the brain into an unrecognizable paste. The snailfish avoids this horrific fate by having a skull that isn't fully closed. It is an open, highly flexible framework. This brilliant, bizarre adaptation allows the pressure of the ocean to flow seamlessly through its head, completely equalizing the internal and external forces. Its brain is not crushed, because there is no rigid wall for the pressure to push against. It has beaten the ocean by simply leaving the door wide open. Furthermore, the snailfish is practically drowning in that horrific, rotting garbage chemical, TMAO. Because it lives exactly on the knife's edge of the biological depth limit, it possesses the absolute highest concentration of TMAO of any living vertebrate. It is essentially a swimming sack of highly toxic anti-crush chemicals. If you were to bring a Mariana snailfish up to the surface and try to smell it, you would immediately regret the decision. It is the most offensive, intensely putrid-smelling creature on the planet. But down in the trench, nobody cares how you smell. What is truly astonishing about the Mariana snailfish is not just that it survives in this apocalyptic pressure cooker, but that it absolutely dominates it. It is not a pitiful, struggling outcast clinging to the edge of existence. In its specific depth zone, it is the top of the food chain. It is the undisputed king. The snailfish feeds primarily on tiny, highly armoured deep-sea crustaceans called amphipods. These amphipods swarm the bottom of the trench, scavenging on whatever microscopic debris falls from above. The snailfish, with its soft, flabby, jelly-like body, glides silently over the pale mud, sucking up these hard-shelled bugs like a biological vacuum cleaner. It's a beautifully ironic reversal of roles. The squishy, completely unarmoured piece of pink jelly is effortlessly hunting and devouring the hard, heavily armoured bugs. And they are highly social, active creatures. The footage from the Mariana Trench shows them vigorously swimming around the bait traps, bumping into each other, effortlessly changing direction, and exhibiting all the lively behaviours of fish you would see in a shallow, sunlit coral reef. They are completely, wonderfully oblivious to the fact that they are casually hanging out in the deadliest environment on the planet. They are the ultimate proof that nature's greatest defence mechanism is not strength. It is not a thick titanium hull, it is not jagged teeth, and it is not a heavy, calcified skeleton. The greatest defence against an unstoppable, crushing force is absolute flexibility. The Mariana snailfish rules the underworld because it has mastered the art of being nothing. It is an empty, watery vessel that allows the wrath of the ocean to pass right through it without leaving a single scratch. However, as triumphant and successful as the snailfish is, it is still bound by the rigid mathematical laws of chemistry. As we discussed earlier, the TMAO chemical shield has a hard limit. As the trench slopes ever downward, plunging past 26,000 feet, reaching toward the absolute bottom of the Challenger Deep at roughly 36,000 feet, the pressure continues to aggressively climb. The snailfish cannot follow. If it descends any deeper, it would have to pack even more TMAO into its cells to keep its proteins from folding, but if it adds any more of the chemical salt, the delicate balance of osmosis will be violently shattered. The water from the ocean would violently rush into its cells to dilute the salt, and the fish would physically burst from the inside out like an overinflated balloon. So, right around the 27,000 foot mark, the gelatinous ghost abruptly stopped. The vertebrate kingdom, the grand evolutionary lineage that produced dinosaurs, eagles, whales, and human beings, finally hits an unbreakable biological brick wall. The fish can go no further. If you look past the snailfish, down into the deepest, darkest, most crushing recesses of the trenches, the water becomes eerily, totally silent. There are no more swimming shadows, there are no more bones, not even squishy ones. It seems finally that we have found the true dead zone. But once again, human logic is completely, embarrassingly wrong. Life does not end when the fish tap out. Life simply gets stranger. Life discards the need for a backbone entirely. But down here, at the absolute bottom of the world, a new problem arises. Scavenging on dead fish scales and microscopic marine snow falling from the surface is a miserable, low-energy existence. It is barely surviving. What if life down here didn't want to just survive on scraps? What if it wanted to build thriving, massive, densely packed cities? What if it wanted to create entirely new, vibrant ecosystems that had absolutely nothing to do with the sun? To find these miraculous oases, we have to look for the places where the Earth's crust cracks open. We have to look for the toxic, boiling, heavily pressurized vents that spew black, sulfurous smoke directly into the freezing abyss. We're about to enter a realm where creatures have figured out how to eat pure poison, where blind crabs farm their own bacteria, and where snails forge their own armour out of solid iron. The fish are gone. Welcome to the chemical underworld. Up until this point in our descent, every single bizarre creature we have looked at, from the flabby, miserable blobfish to the ghostly, transparent snailfish, has been secretly relying on a lie. Even though they live in a realm of absolute freezing blackness, they are still, ultimately, children of the sun. They survive by scavenging the pathetic, rotting scraps of marine snow that fall from the sunlit world thousands of feet above. Because of this, scientists confidently believe that if you magically turned off the sun tomorrow, the surface would freeze, the plants would die, and eventually the deep sea would starve to death too. It was the most sacred, unbreakable law of biology. All complex ecosystems require solar energy to exist, period. But in 1977, human logic took another massive, humiliating beating. A team of geologists crammed themselves into a deep-sea submersible called Alvin and sank to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean near the Galapagos Rift, at a depth of about 8,000 feet. They were not marine biologists, they were rock nerds. They went down there specifically to look at completely dead, boring tectonic plates. They expected to find a barren, silent desert of cooled lava and pale mud. Instead, out of the pitch-black freezing void, their headlights illuminated a bustling, overcrowded, violently vibrant alien metropolis. They had accidentally discovered hydrothermal vents, and in doing so, they completely shattered everything humanity thought we knew about how life functions in the universe. To understand the sheer insanity of this environment, you have to look at the geology. Down at the bottom of the ocean, the Earth's crust is cracked. Freezing seawater seeps deep down into these jagged fissures, getting incredibly close to the planet's subterranean mantle. The water is superheated by the magma, violently dissolving heavy metals and toxic chemicals from the surrounding rocks. It then shoots back up through the ocean floor, blasting out of massive towering mineral chimneys known as black smokers. The water violently spewing out of these chimneys is completely black, choked with toxic sulfur, lead, cobalt, and copper. But the most terrifying thing about this water is its temperature. It is blasting out at a staggering 750 degrees Fahrenheit, around 400 degrees Celsius. It is hot enough to instantly melt solid lead. Logically, water that hot should instantly vaporize into steam. But remember where we are. We are under the crushing apocalyptic weight of the deep ocean. The pressure here is so unimaginably intense that it physically pins the water molecules together. It violently forbids the water from expanding into a gas. So, you have a jet of heavy, toxic black fluid that is hundreds of degrees hotter than boiling point, remaining entirely liquid, violently colliding with ocean water that is barely hovering above freezing. It is an absolute witch's brew of extreme pressure, extreme temperature, and extreme poison. A human being exposed to a black smoker would be simultaneously crushed to the size of a suitcase, boiled alive, and poisoned with heavy metals in a fraction of a millisecond. And yet, clinging directly to the sides of these boiling toxic chimneys, thriving in the most violently hostile environment on Earth, was a dense, incredibly lush forest of biological freaks. Because the sun is completely irrelevant here, nature had to invent an entirely new way to power the food chain. If there is no light for photosynthesis, you have to use chemicals. This process is called chemosynthesis. Down here, specialized, highly resilient bacteria have evolved to do the impossible. They essentially breathe the highly toxic hydrogen sulfide gas spewing from the vents, a chemical that smells like rotting eggs and is wildly lethal to almost every other living thing on the planet. They eat this poison, mix it with oxygen dissolved in the water, and magically cook it into pure energetic sugar. These toxic-eating bacteria are the foundation of a bizarre, sunless empire, and the undisputed king of this toxic oasis is one of the most visually striking, deeply weird animals ever discovered, the giant tube worm known scientifically as Riftia pachyptila. When the geologists in the Alvin submersible first saw them, they were utterly mesmerized. The giant tube-bear worms look like they belong on another planet. They grow in massive, tangled clusters, clinging rigidly to the boiling rock. They secrete thick, white, highly durable tubes made of chitin, the same tough material that makes up a crab's shell. These tubes can grow to be an astonishing 8 to 10 feet tall. Bursting vibrantly out of the top of these white plastic-like tubes is a massive, fleshy plume that is coloured an incredibly brilliant, shocking shade of blood red. They look like giant deep-sea lipsticks, but the biology hiding inside that white tube is what makes them true monsters of adaptation. When marine biologists finally got their hands on a giant tube worm and sliced it open to see what it had been eating, they were completely baffled. The worm had absolutely no mouth, it had no teeth, it had no throat, no stomach, no intestines, and no anus. It lacked an entire digestive system. It was essentially a completely sealed meat bag living in a toxic pressure cooker. How does an 8-foot-tall animal survive without ever eating a single thing? It survives because it has completely outsourced its digestion. The giant tube worm is essentially just a highly advanced living apartment complex for bacteria. Instead of a stomach, the worm has a massive specialized internal organ called a trophosome. This organ takes up almost the entire volume of the worm's body, and it is absolutely packed with billions upon billions of those toxic-eating chemosynthetic bacteria. The relationship is a masterpiece of evolutionary teamwork. The worm's brilliant red plume is acting exactly like a giant underwater gill. The reason it is so shockingly red is that it's absolutely saturated with hemoglobin, the exact same complex protein that makes human blood red. But the worm's hemoglobin is highly modified. When the worm waves its red fleshy plume in the toxic water, its blood aggressively grabs the lethal hydrogen sulfide and the oxygen from the vent fluid. Usually hydrogen sulfide binds to hemoglobin and instantly kills the animal. But the giant tube worm has a biological cheat code that safely transports this deadly poison deep inside its own body, delivering it directly to the billions of bacteria living in its trophosome. The bacteria eagerly devour the toxic gas, perform their chemical magic trick, and produce a massive, endless supply of sugar and nutrients. They feed the worm from the inside out. In exchange for the free food, the worm provides the bacteria with a safe, stable, perfectly temperature-controlled home, hovering just inches away from a boiling jet of deadly minerals. The giant tube worm doesn't need to hunt. It doesn't need to chew. It just stands there in the crushing dark, bravely sucking up poison, letting its internal roommates cook the meals. It grows at an incredibly rapid pace, creating massive, dense forests that provide shelter for an entire ecosystem of other bizarre creatures. But as brilliant as the giant tube worm is, it is essentially just a stationary farmer. The deep-sea vents are crawling with things that move, things that scavenge, and things that have taken extreme survival to an even more ridiculous heavy metal extreme. We're about to meet a blind crab that actively grows its own food on its incredibly hairy arms, and a snail that decided squishy flesh was a terrible idea and opted instead to literally forge its own suit of iron armour. While the giant tube worm is undeniably a masterpiece of extreme survival, it is, at the end of the day, just a stationary meat tube. It firmly glues itself to a boiling rock and spends its entire life in one spot, bravely sucking up poison while its internal bacterial roommates do all the heavy lifting. But the hydrothermal vents are not just a silent forest of red-tip tubes. They are crawling with highly active, highly aggressive scavengers that have taken the concept of surviving a toxic, highly pressurized pressure cooker to completely absurd new levels. If the tube worm is the passive landlord of the abyss, the next creature on our list is its most eccentric, unhinged, and brilliantly bizarre neighbour. It is a creature that decided the best way to survive at the bottom of the ocean was to put on a thick fur coat and become a blind, toxic farmer. Meet the Yeti crab, scientifically known as Kiwa hirsuta. When marine biologists first discovered this creature in 2005 lurking around the vents of the Pacific Antarctic Ridge, they were utterly bewildered. Down in a pitch-black environment where the water temperature fluctuates violently between near freezing and instantly boiling, they found a pale, ghostly white crustacean that looks suspiciously like a normal lobster, but with one glaring, ridiculous difference. Its massive front claws and its legs were completely covered in a dense, shaggy covering of pale yellow fur. It looked exactly like the mythical, abominable snowman of the Himalayas, hence the name. But down in the crushing abyss, fashion is entirely irrelevant. That shaggy fur is not there to keep the crab warm. In fact, it is not actually fur at all. It is a dense collection of highly specialised bristle-like structures called setae. And the Yeti crab is not using them for insulation. It is using them as a mobile, highly toxic agricultural plot. Because the Yeti crab lives in absolute eternal darkness, evolution completely stripped away its eyes. It is entirely blind. But it does not need to see, because it never has to actually hunt for its food. It simply grows its meals directly on its own arms. Those shaggy, fur-like bristles are specifically designed to act as a perfect, high surface area breeding ground for the exact same chemosynthetic bacteria that live inside the giant tube worms. The Yeti crab is essentially cultivating a lush microscopic garden of poison-eating bacteria directly on its own exoskeleton. But a garden needs tending, and the bacteria need a constant supply of toxic hydrogen, sulfide and oxygen to survive. So the blind Yeti crab engages in a bizarre rhythmic ritual. It crawls right up to the very edge of the jagged fissures, spewing black, boiling, toxic vent fluid. It finds a spot where the water temperature is perfectly balanced. Not too cold, but not hot enough to instantly boil it alive in its own shell. Then, it begins to dance. It repeatedly and rhythmically waves its massive hairy claws back and forth through the highly pressurized, chemical-rich water. It is actively bathing its bacterial crop in the exact toxic nutrients they need to multiply. It just stands there in the dark, happily swinging its hairy arms over a boiling pit of sulfur. Once the bacteria have consumed the toxic chemicals and multiplied into a thick, nutritious mat of sugar-rich slime, the harvest begins. The Yeti crab uses a highly specialized comb-like appendage located near its mouth to meticulously scrape the bacteria right off its own hairy arms, shoveling the microscopic feast directly into its mouth. It is a brilliant, self-sustaining loop of survival. It is a blind farmer that wears its own crop, constantly harvesting a toxic garden in a place that should violently crush any living thing to dust. However, as incredible as a farming hairy crab might be, it is still playing by the relatively normal rules of organic biology. It has a chitinous shell, it has flesh, and it has bristles. But the hydrothermal vents are an environment of extreme extremes. They are spewing vast quantities of heavy metals directly from the Earth's mantle into the crushing water. And in this chemical underworld there is one creature that looked at all those heavy, toxic metals and decided that having a squishy, fleshy body was a terrible, vulnerable idea. It decided that if it was going to survive the apocalyptic pressure, the boiling heat, and the crushing claws of hungry crabs, it needed to literally forge itself into a medieval knight. Behold the scaly-foot snail, also known as the sea pangolin, or Chrysomalon squamiferum. It is, without a single shadow of a doubt, the most heavy metal creature to ever exist on planet Earth. Generally speaking, snails are pathetic. They are soft, slimy, vulnerable little morsels hiding inside fragile calcium-based shells that a human toddler can easily crush with a light step. In the deep ocean, where the pressure is already trying to violently shatter calcium-based structures, a normal snail would be instantly liquefied. But the scaly-foot snail does not rely on fragile calcium. It relies on iron. Living exclusively on the sides of hydrothermal vents in the Indian Ocean, under miles of crushing water, this snail absorbs the dissolved iron and sulfur violently spewing from the Earth's crust, and miraculously incorporates them directly into its own biology. It is a biological blacksmith. Its shell is an absolute masterpiece of evolutionary armor plating consisting of 3 distinct layers. The innermost layer is a highly calcified material standard for snails, but the middle layer is a thick, squishy, highly compressible organic periostracum. This layer acts exactly like the shock-absorbing foam inside a motorcycle helmet. If a giant crab manages to grab the snail and violently squeezes it with its crushing claws, this spongy middle layer absorbs the kinetic energy, drastically dissipating the force and preventing the shell from cracking. But it is the outermost layer of the shell that defies all biological logic. The snail plates the entire exterior of its shell in crejit, a highly magnetic form of iron sulfide. It is literally wearing an iron helmet, and the armour does not stop there. The soft, exposed underbelly of a snail, the fleshy foot it uses to crawl across the rocks, is usually its most vulnerable point. The scaly-foot snail solved this problem by covering its entire foot with hundreds of thick, overlapping iron-infused scales. It is wearing a literal, biological suit of chainmail. These iron scales protect its squishy flesh from the scalding heat of the vent fluid, from the crushing weight of the ocean, and from the venomous, armor-piercing darts fired by predatory deep-sea cone snails. It is a walking tank. It is the only known animal in the entire history of biology to incorporate iron sulfide into its skeleton. Its armor is so incredibly dense and so concentrated with heavy metal that if you were to somehow haul one of these snails up to the surface and drag a strong magnet over it, the snail would literally stick to the magnet. The scaly-foot snail and the Yeti crab are the ultimate testaments to the absolute terrifying tenacity of life. They have taken the deadliest, most hostile, violently toxic environments on the planet and turned them into a thriving, bustling empire. They prove that life does not need the sun, it does not need a gentle breeze, and it does not need perfect temperatures to survive. But the hydrothermal vents, as brutal as they are, still offer a constant, rushing source of chemical energy. The creatures there are hyperactive, heavily armoured, and constantly feeding. What happens when we leave the violent energy of the vents behind? What happens when we push past the bottom of the ocean floor, past the mud, and drill directly down into the solid, unyielding, pitch-black rock of the Earth's crust itself? Can life exist buried miles beneath solid stone, where there is no sunlight, no vent fluid, no marine snow, and absolutely zero room to move? The answer is yes, but the creatures hiding inside the rock have had to make the ultimate sacrifice. They haven't just conquered pressure, they have conquered time itself. We have plunged through the twilight zone, touched the freezing flat mud of the abyssal plain, marvelled at the gelatinous ghosts in the deepest trenches, and watched blind crabs farm poison in the boiling shadows of hydrothermal vents. We have seen life conquer the most violent, crushing aquatic environments on the planet. But if we are being completely honest, every single creature we have talked about so far has had one massive fundamental luxury. They had space to move. They had water to swim in, mud to crawl across, or at the very least, a boiling chimney to cling to. To find the true, undisputed masters of extreme survival, we must leave the ocean entirely. We must go past the bottom of the world. We must grab a heavy industrial drill and bore directly down into the solid, unyielding, pitch-black rock of the Earth's crust itself. Welcome to the deep biosphere, a place where the concept of Priya shifts from hydrostatic, the weight of water, to lithostatic, the unimaginable, apocalyptic weight of solid stone. When you drill miles deep into the Earth's continental crust, the environment fundamentally changes. There are no vast open caverns. There are no underground lakes. There is only solid granite, basalt, and extreme suffocating claustrophobia. The only available living space exists within microscopic hairline fractures in the rock, or inside tiny isolated pores of water trapped during the formation of the planet. Down here, the pressure is not just pushing against you, it is actively trying to crush the very rock you live inside into a denser state of matter. The temperature steadily rises the deeper you go, radiating outward from the molten mantle of the planet. There is absolutely zero sunlight, completely zero oxygen, and absolutely no organic food falling from the surface. A piece of rock buried 3 miles beneath the surface has been completely sealed off from the rest of the biological world for billions of years. By every known law of physics, chemistry, and biology, solid rock miles beneath the Earth's surface should be a completely sterile dead zone. It should be the ultimate impenetrable tomb. And yet, when human miners started blasting their way deep into the Earth, nature delivered yet another humiliating slap to our scientific arrogance. In South Africa, the Mponeng gold mine is one of the deepest man-made holes on the planet. It plunges over 2.5 miles straight down into the Earth's crust. It is a grueling, terrifying place for humans to work. The rock walls down there radiate a blistering heat of up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius. To keep the miners from instantly dying of heat stroke, the mining company has to pump thousands of tons of ice slurry down into the tunnels every single day just to artificially cool the air. The lithostatic pressure is so immense that the walls of the tunnels constantly groan, pop, and occasionally violently explode inward as the rock desperately tries to close the empty space the humans have dug. In 2006, a team of scientists ventured down into the crushing, sweltering depths of this mine. They weren't looking for gold. They were looking for microscopic cracks in the rock walls that were leaking tiny amounts of ancient trapped groundwater. They found a fracture, carefully extracted a sample of the water that had not seen the surface in tens of millions of years, and put it under a microscope. They expected to see dead, sterile water. Instead, they found a thriving microscopic metropolis. They discovered a highly specialized, deeply weird species of bacteria that scientists later named Candidatus desulforudis od exviator. The name translates roughly to the bold traveller, a delightfully poetic title for a bug that literally never goes anywhere. This bacteria is an absolute freak of nature. It lives in complete and utter isolation. In fact, it is the only known ecosystem on Earth consisting of a single biological species. It has no predators, no prey, and no neighbours. It is entirely alone in the dark, trapped inside a microscopic crack, surrounded by millions of tons of crushing rock. But how does it survive? In the deep ocean vents, life eats toxic sulfur gas. But inside solid rock, there is no vent. There is no rushing water to bring new chemicals. There is absolutely nothing to eat. To survive the absolute void, this bacteria had to figure out how to literally eat radiation. Deep inside the Earth's crust, there are trace amounts of radioactive elements like uranium, naturally embedded in the rock. As this uranium slowly decays over millions of years, it releases radiation. When that radiation hits the tiny, microscopic droplets of water trapped in the rock alongside the bacteria, it violently splits the water molecules apart in a process called radiolysis. This splitting action produces a tiny, microscopic amount of hydrogen gas. The Audaxviator bacteria sucks up the hydrogen gas and uses it as a chemical fuel to extract trace minerals from the surrounding rock. It is literally surviving on the faint radioactive decay of the planet itself. It is a nuclear-powered, rock-eating zombie. But eating radioactive rock is an incredibly miserable low-yield diet. It provides almost no energy. It is the biological equivalent of trying to survive by licking a single grain of sugar once a week. Because the energy intake is so staggeringly low, and the crushing pressure of the surrounding rock is so intense, the bacteria cannot afford to waste a single molecule of energy on unnecessary things, like moving, or breathing quickly, or reproducing. And this is where the deep biosphere reveals its most terrifying, mind-bending survival cheat code. To survive the crushing weight of the world and the absolute absence of food, these organisms have conquered the one thing human beings fear most: time. If you put a normal surface bacteria in a warm petri dish with plenty of food, it will rapidly grow and divide into 2 new cells in about 20 minutes. The biological clock ticks furiously fast. But deep in the continental crust, time effectively stops. The deep Earth bacteria live at a pace that is so agonizingly, incomprehensibly slow that scientists actively debate whether they can truly be considered alive in the traditional sense, or if they are simply in a state of indefinite suspended animation. They are the ultimate biological zombies, because they have so little energy. They do not divide every 20 minutes. They don't divide every week or every year. Scientists estimate that a single cell of deep Earth bacteria might take anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 years just to gather enough energy to divide exactly one time. Think about the sheer, staggering scale of that time frame. Let's say a deep Earth bacteria was born roughly 5,000 years ago. Up on the surface, human beings were just figuring out how to build the Great Pyramids of Giza. Entire empires, the Romans, the Mongols, the Aztecs, rose to absolute world-dominating power, fought bloody, apocalyptic wars, and completely collapsed into dust. The printing press was invented, the Industrial Revolution choked the skies with coal, humanity split the atom, fought 2 world wars, walked on the surface of the moon, and invented the internet. And during all of that, During the entire recorded, chaotic, bloody history of human civilization, down in the crushing, silent dark, that single microscopic zombie bacteria was just slowly, quietly gathering enough energy to blink. They are living statues. By aggressively slowing down their metabolism to a virtual standstill, they require almost zero energy to maintain their cellular structures. The immense lithostatic pressure of the miles of rock above them doesn't crush them, because they are already trapped in microscopic pockets, perfectly equalized with the surrounding environment. They have essentially hit the ultimate biological pause button. When things get incredibly tough, when the water dries up or the radioactive fuel runs out completely, they have an even more extreme backup plan. They can form endospores, essentially wrapping their DNA in an indestructible, heavily armoured microscopic vault, shutting down absolutely all biological functions and going to sleep. In this dormant state, they can survive extreme heat, total dehydration, massive doses of radiation and unimaginable crushing pressure. They can sit in that dark rocky tomb for millions, perhaps even hundreds of millions of years, completely dead to the world, just waiting for a microscopic drop of water or a tiny shift in the tectonic plates to wake them back up. We used to think life was fragile. We thought it required a perfect, delicate balance of sunlight, warmth, and fresh air to exist. But the deep biosphere proves that life is a stubborn, relentless, terrifyingly patient infection. It proves that if you bury life under miles of solid rock, starve it of oxygen, cook it with geothermal heat, and crush it with the weight of mountains, it doesn't just die. It simply goes to sleep, feeds on the radioactive heartbeat of the planet, and outlasts eternity. But as we finally hit the absolute rocky basement of planet Earth, a terrifying and awe-inspiring thought begins to emerge. If life can turn itself into jelly to survive the hydrostatic crush of the Mariana Trench, if it can forge iron armour in the boiling toxicity of the hydrothermal vents, and if it can eat radiation while buried alive under miles of solid stone, what does that mean for the rest of the universe? If the absolute worst and most hostile environments on Earth are absolutely crawling with freakish adaptable monsters, it is time we stop looking down and start looking up. Because the rules of biology we just learnt in the abyss are about to blow the doors off our search for alien life. For decades, humanity's search for extraterrestrial life was driven by a concept called the Goldilocks zone. Astrobiologists, the highly educated scientists whose entire job is to look for aliens, had a very strict, incredibly arrogant checklist. They believed that for a planet to harbour life, it had to be positioned at the exact right distance from its host star. Not too close, or the surface water boils away into steam. Not too far, or the water freezes solid. It had to be just right. We assumed, with our typical human hubris, that the entire universe needed to bask in a warm, comfortable sunbeam, simply because we do. But the squishy Mariana snailfish, the blind Yeti crab, and the radioactive zombie bacteria of the deep biosphere violently took that checklist, tore it to shreds, and threw it directly into the garbage. If life on Earth can comfortably thrive in a freezing, crushing abyss without ever seeing a single photon of sunlight, if it can build bustling, heavily armoured cities around boiling, toxic chemical vents, and if it can survive buried alive inside solid rock by eating radiation, then the Goldilocks zone is an absolute illusion. The universe suddenly just got a whole lot more crowded. And to find these new neighbours, we do not need to look at distant sun-drenched planets in other galaxies. We just need to look at the massive ice cubes floating right here in our own solar system. Let us look at Jupiter. Millions of miles away from the comfortable warmth of the Earth, where the sun is nothing but a cold, pathetic, distant speck in the black sky, Jupiter possesses a moon named Europa. If you look at Europa through a telescope, it looks completely dead. It is a smooth, scarred sphere of solid ice, relentlessly bombarded by Jupiter's lethal radiation belts. Under the old, arrogant rules of biology, Europa is a sterile frozen graveyard. But that ice is just a thick, heavy lid. Beneath a frozen crust that is miles thick, Europa hides a massive pitch-black global ocean of liquid saltwater. In fact, that single, frozen moon contains more than twice as much liquid water as all of the oceans on planet Earth combined. But how can it be liquid so far from the Sun? The answer is gravity. Jupiter is so unbelievably massive that its immense gravitational pull literally kneads Europa like a ball of bread dough. As the moon orbits, it is constantly stretched, squished and pulled, generating immense internal friction. This friction creates massive amounts of geothermal heat deep within Europa's rocky core. That heat has to escape. And as it rises through the floor of that hidden alien ocean, it almost certainly creates the exact same hydrothermal vents we see at the bottom of the Pacific. Now, think about the environment at the bottom of Europa's hidden ocean. Absolute, eternal, sensory deprivation darkness. Freezing water temperatures abruptly interrupted by violent columns of boiling, toxic, mineral-rich heat. And an unimaginable, crushing hydrostatic pressure caused by dozens of miles of heavy water and thick ice pressing down from above. Does that sound familiar? It is the exact same hellscape we just spent this entire journey exploring. If the Earth's hydrothermal vents can support 8-foot-tall giant tube worms that bleed red and survive by eating pure poison, there's absolutely no physical or chemical reason why the vents on Europa cannot support their own brand of bizarre, squishy freaks. We see the exact same promise on Enceladus, a tiny icy moon orbiting Saturn. Enceladus is literally shooting massive, violent geysers of salty ocean water straight up through the jagged cracks in its ice crust and out into the deadly vacuum of space. When the Cassini spacecraft flew directly through those geysers and chemically tasted the water, it found the exact organic molecules, the salts, and the silica grains that prove hydrothermal vents are actively churning away at the bottom of its sunless sea. We have spent nearly a century scanning the stars with massive radio dishes, waiting for highly intelligent aliens to broadcast a mathematically perfect signal, hoping they will arrive in sleek, silver spaceships. We assumed the aliens would be exactly like us, just a little bit smarter. But the crushing depths of our own ocean have taught us a much more humbling, bizarre truth. The first extraterrestrial life we find will almost certainly not be a little green man with a laser gun. It will likely be a blind, heavily armoured, gelatinous alien weirdo, happily chewing on sulphur in the crushing dark, entirely and blissfully oblivious to the frozen, irradiated universe above its head. Life does not need a gentle sky. It does not need a warm sun. It just needs a crack in the rock, a drop of water, and the stubborn, ruthless will to survive. Our planet has thrown absolutely everything it has at these creatures. It plunged them into eternal, suffocating darkness. It froze them. It tried to boil them alive in toxic volcanic acid. And it slammed them with thousands of atmospheres of bone-crushing pressure. But life did not break. It simply smiled, melted its own bones, forged suits of literal iron armour, and turned absolute hell into a thriving, bustling home. The creatures of the abyss prove that life is not nearly as fragile as we like to think. It is incredibly stubborn, relentlessly ruthless, and beautifully weird. But there is one final, deeply tragic irony to this story. The Mariana snailfish can effortlessly withstand an environment that would instantly crumple a military submarine. The scaly-foot snail can casually deflect the crushing claws of predators with its heavy metal chainmail. But neither of these biological masterpieces, meticulously forged over millions of years of brutal evolutionary warfare, has any defense against us. When explorer Victor Vescovo broke the record for the deepest submarine dive in history in 2019, reaching the absolute bottom of the Challenger Deep, he did not just find new, bizarre species. Lying there in the pristine, ancient mud, nearly 7 miles beneath the surface, was a discarded plastic shopping bag and candy wrappers. The invincible monsters of the deep, capable of effortlessly defeating the crushing weight of an entire ocean, are now slowly choking on the careless garbage dropped by a civilization of arrogant apes living in the sunlight. It is a sobering, heartbreaking reminder that we are actively destroying a magnificent alien world long before we even fully understand it. Thank you so much for joining us on this terrifying, fascinating descent into the dark. If you loved exploring the greatest mysteries of our planet and diving into the weirdest corners of science, please hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and let us know in the comments which deep-sea freak of nature was your absolute favourite. Stay curious, keep exploring, and we will see you on the next adventure.